Hello, my name is Cedric, and today we're going to talk about how business experts learn from history. And we're going to do something interesting where we're going to use a theory of expertise, which you would think is a little academic, but then we're going to use it to learn how to copy them to accelerate our own expertise, whether it's investing expertise or business expertise or even how to get wisdom in life. A quick 20-second background. My name is Cedric. I write a blog called Common Cog. And Common Cog is a site about business expertise and methods to accelerate it. And I'm mostly writing it because I'm trying to accelerate my own business expertise. I suppose you can call me a business researcher, but I really consider myself a business operator. And you can sort of see why I'm so interested in this topic, because I want to be the best operator I can possibly be. Today, I'm going to talk about one method that I found for accelerating business expertise. And at this point, I'm quite convinced that it works because I've tested it on more than a handful, probably more than 100 at this point, of my readers. And I've been putting it to practice on commoncog.com and testing it by publishing according to this theory of expertise. So, let's get started. I want to set up the problem for you with a quippy quip. So this is a fun little saying that I like from Frank Westheimer. He's an American chemist, and he has this thing where he says a month in the lab can often save an hour in the library. And when I saw that, I thought, this is quite funny. The business version of this is a decade of business experience can often save a few months of biography reading. And this sort of ties into the mainstream belief, usually quoted, talked about by many famous investors and business people, that reading history is useful in business, that reading history and reading biography is useful in investing. But if you take a step back, right, you have to sort of ask yourself, how exactly is learning from biography, learning from reading about other people's experiences actually useful to you as a practicing business operator or investor, or a person who just wants to learn lessons so that you can apply it in your life and avoid the pain of making mistakes? Typically, people who say that you want to learn history is making some form of the following argument. You don't want to only learn business from doing business, right? And if you're smart, you don't want to only learn investing from doing investing. The reality is that your life is too short, right? And it's actually a little bit dumb to learn just from your own experiences. You instead want to learn from a pool of experiences that is larger than your own. You want to learn from the mistake of others so that you don't have to make those mistakes in your life, right? This is in some ways a definition for wisdom, right? Wisdom is not making mistakes that you could have avoided if you had listened to the advice of betters and more experienced people who have gone down the path. What say you? But how, right? This is easy to say, and you hear this argument being made a lot, but it's actually really difficult to learn from history, right? This, I think, should be obvious. You cannot actually learn lessons from history. If you think about it, right, things that you learn, stories that you read from history books or biographies are path dependent. They are almost by definition unique to the stakeholders, the people who were present, unique to the specific time and specific industry and specific setup that was in place, which means that regardless of what you're studying, whether it's war history or if it's business history or some particularly weird market structure due to the events of the time, it's very difficult to make draw generalizable principles or lessons from things that you study in the past. Just because something has happened in the past doesn't mean that it will happen again, and it doesn't mean that even if something similar happens again, it will happen in exactly the same way. And how can it, right? Because the people change, the technology change, the situation changes. So, very quick illustration. So I want to tell you a quick story, all right? This is a fairly famous anecdote that you may already know. In 1980, IBM signed a non-exclusive deal with Microsoft for PC-DOS, which, with the passage of time, we now know it as MS-DOS, Microsoft Disk Operating System. And at the time, this IBM was the incumbent. And in fact, that's understating things a little. For the longest time, the entire computer industry was effectively IBM, right? And IBM mostly produced computers that we now call mainframes. These are computers the size of rooms, and they primarily sold these mainframes to large businesses. Now, in the years since IBM's total monopoly, there were two generations of computers that IBM missed out on. These were called the mini computer and then the microcomputer revolutions. And other companies successfully won in those races. Now, in 1980, IBM was very much aware that they were behind on microcomputers and mini computers, and they saw this new thing called the personal computer, which was launched by Apple with the Macintosh. And they wanted in, right? They wanted to be part of this wave. They didn't want to miss out like they had with the two prior generations. So they rushed a personal computer to market, and they got Microsoft to make the operating system because they didn't have the time to write their own operating system. This deal permanently changed Microsoft's fate, right? What happened was that because IBM rushed the PC to market, and because they were so confident of their dominance in computers, they were willing to let Microsoft have a non-exclusive deal, and Microsoft would have royalties for every copy of DOS that they sold with their computers. Well, what happened next? We know what happened next, right? What happened was that there was a wave of IBM PC clones that flooded the market. And because DOS was readily available to all of them, effectively you could have an IBM compatible computer PC for effectively a lower price. And as more and more clones came on the market, the price kept dropping, and eventually the IBM PC became a commodity. So this now, historians today sort of look back on that as IBM's big mistake. And very much, when people sort of look at Microsoft before and after the IBM deal, this single deal positioned Microsoft for the entire future that we now know Microsoft for, right? Microsoft is the giant that it is the incumbent that it is, and it was very much, the first software company to prove that the software business model was this ridiculously good, high margin, valuable business model. So Microsoft today is a giant, and IBM has been still around, but pretty much every historian sort of says that particular deal was a mistake on IBM's front, and Microsoft won big, and IBM ultimately lost the PC race. So this is a fairly famous story in the annals of computer history. What lesson would you conclude from it? Might you say, if an incumbent tells you to develop an operating system, you say yes? Might you, conclude that if an incumbent tells you to develop an operating system, you should ask for the rights to license it to others? Could maybe one conclusion be that open operating systems, open platforms always beat closed platforms? Because certainly, Microsoft DOS did benefit from the network effects of applications built on top of it. Right? Things like Lotus 123, which introduced the spreadsheet to the world. And could you maybe conclude that one lesson is operating systems are the bottleneck of power in the tech industry? Right? Now, these are actually quite naive lessons, right? And the way that we can sort of talk about it is the game that I like to play to sort of remind myself that history is not that simple. You can't draw simple, generalizable lessons from specific events. And the trick that I use is something I call the except when it doesn't trick. And the way the trick works is very simple. When you have a proposal, you think that there might be a specific generalizable lesson from some event in history, you stop and you ask yourself, is that true? Is there a situation where it's not true, where the opposite could be true? And the way you sort of shorthand it for yourself is except when it doesn't. So I'll show you an example. One, the naive lesson could be maybe when an incumbent tells you to develop an operating system, you should say yes. except when you should say no, because there are situations, I'm sure you can come up with unique situations in the years afterwards where it's the wrong move to spend time building an operating system, right? If the lesson is, if an incumbent tells you to develop an operating system, ask for the rights to license it to others, right? Well, maybe everybody knows the story of IBM and Microsoft, and the incumbent now is smart enough to not allow you to license it to others, right? They themselves are aware of history, and therefore they don't make the same mistakes. And so therefore you don't even get the decision. Maybe if the lesson is open platforms always beat closed platforms, right? You can sort of say, except when a closed platform is an advantage and is the right move. And it's not very difficult to think of a situation where it played out differently. For example, during the mobile era, when Android versus iOS was, the operating systems were sort of duking it out, it was not to Apple's advantage that they had an open operating system. In fact, it was an advantage to them that they had a closed operating system. And of course, you would say that, it's a different situation, different dynamics. That is exactly the point. You cannot draw generalizable principles from specific events in history. And, the final thing is that operating systems, if you conclude that, from this lesson in history, operating systems are the bottleneck to power in the tech industry, well, except when it isn't, which it wasn't. It wasn't during the internet era, and it wasn't during the mobile era. Maybe to some degree it was, but you cannot make such pronouncements easily just purely based on this slice of history. Okay. So this actually applies more broadly than history, right? You can sort of just take a look at that single anecdote and say, it is hard to learn lessons from history because business events are path dependent and they're unique. They depend on the specifics of the industry and the specifics of the events. But it also applies actually to your own experiences. If you run a company, and say you run a company for 4, 5, 7 years and it fails, right? And somebody asks you, what lessons do you learn? It's actually quite hard to generalize from them. And it's very easy to learn the wrong lessons that you then bring into your next venture, which could be very different because, the world has changed over the course of 7 years. And the next thing that you start might call for different moves than the things that you conclude from your prior venture, right? And yet, famous investors, famous business people, and I'm just going to show you a tiny slice, right? They all say that reading biography and reading history is valuable. Here's Warren Buffett, right? Warren Buffett says, and I quote, "I read and read and read. I probably read 5 to 6 hours per day. I read 5 daily newspapers. I read a fair number of magazines. I read 10Ks. I read annual reports, and I read a lot of other things too. I've always enjoyed reading. I love reading biographies, for example." And his right-hand man, Charlie Munger, the late Charlie Munger, who died recently, died in 2023, says, "I am a biography nut myself, and I think when you're trying to teach the great concepts that work, it helps to tie them into the lives and personalities of the people who develop them. I think you learn economics better if you make Adam Smith your friend." That sounds funny, making friends among the eminent dead. But if you go through life making friends with the eminent dead who had the right ideas, I think it will work better for you in life and work better in education. It's way better than just giving the basic concepts. So there's Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, and if you take a step back, you can look around in your life, and I'm willing to bet that you've met people who many would consider wise, right? We might know they might not be famous, but you can certainly say that there are certain people that you meet who are wise beyond their years, in the sense that they don't make mistakes, that they don't have to. And here's Charlie Munger again, going, "In my whole life, I've known no wise people over a broad subject matter area who didn't read all the time. None, zero." Right? There are others that I did not include in this presentation, right? Other business people, other investors, but it's usually mainstream accepted wisdom that reading biography and reading history is useful. So how do they do it? How do they do it? How do they get value out of reading history, given the problems of history that we've just discussed? Well, we don't have to figure this out ourselves. It turns out that there is a body of work called naturalistic decision making. This is not a this is not a good name for what they actually do. Right? That is primarily funded by the U.S. military and eventually industry. It started in 1989, which means that it's about 3 decades of research at this point. And what they specialize in is that they focus on learning how experts make decisions in the real world under pressure, in the complexity and messiness of real world domains, whether it's business or medicine or even firefighting or war fighting. And their specific speciality is extracting the mental models from the heads of experts, the actual sort of structures of expertise from the heads of experts, and turning that into applied training programs to accelerate expertise. And this picture of a book, you can't see it if you're just listening to the audio, is it's a book cover of a book called Accelerated Expertise, and it was published because the Department of Defense commissioned a report summarizing all the known expertise acceleration methods, right? So if we can figure out how the experts do it, then we can copy it, right? And it turns out that this book introduces 2 theories that these various researchers have had more than a decade's worth of success using, that explains how experts in domains like business and investing get good by reading biography. It explains what goes on in their heads, and that means that we can then copy what they do for our own use to accelerate our own expertise. The theory we're going to look at today is called cognitive flexibility theory. It is one of the 2 theories in accelerated expertise, right? But this theory gives us the answer to how business experts learn from history. And what cognitive flexibility theory really is that it's a theory of expertise in ill-structured domains. Specifically, it tells us how experts think in ill-structured domains. And of course, because we're talking about ill-structured domains, we have to talk about what that is. We have to define what it is. An ill-structured domain is actually quite simple to understand. It is a domain with concepts, but the way the concepts are instantiated in the real world are hugely variable. Another way of saying that is that nearly every case you deal with is unique. Now, this kind of makes sense. If you think about business, you think about investing, there may be concepts that you can learn about in a textbook, right? But when you're looking at the real world, the chaos, the complexity of the real world, when you're reading history, of course, we've just talked about how nearly everything is somewhat path dependent and very context specific. And so ill-structured domains is really a domain that we care about building expertise in, because I would assert that most interesting domains in the real world are ill-structured domains. Let's go into one example, though, that is not business and not investing. It turns out that cognitive flexibility theory comes from the study of medicine, or rather, to be more precise, it was originally developed when trying to figure out methods to accelerate the expertise of young medical students and turn them into experienced doctors, right? Medicine is an ill-structured domain, right? You can learn of certain concepts like heart attack or diabetes or virus in a medical textbook. But the way that heart attacks, for example, show up in the real world are hugely variable, right? So heart attacks, you might think that a heart attack is just like a patient falling over, clutching their chest, groaning in pain. And that's the textbook example of what, all of us think the stereotypical example of what a heart attack looks like. But heart attacks can show up in many ways, right? They can show up as indigestion, slowly developing over a period of days. It can also last, a full week or maybe even slightly more than a week, and initially present as an unhealthy pallor, like your face, your skin tone just looks sickly and weird. And then later you slowly run out of breath, and then you go to the hospital, and it turns out that you're in the middle of an incredibly slow developing heart attack. These are all real things, right? And the challenge is that because human bodies are such complex systems, and human variability from individual to individual is a thing, right? How a heart attack shows up depends on your gender, your medical history, even your race, and of course your pre-existing conditions. And it just stems from the fact that the body is a complex system. So what's the training challenge here? The training challenge here is that, expert doctors who have experienced working in a hospital for a bit, practicing medicine. They know not to fixate on the concept that is the heart attack. They know that heart attacks can show up in many different ways, right? But the training challenge is that medical students do not think like this, right? They spend the first part of their education journey in a classroom, learning medical concepts from a textbook or from lectures. And it turns out when these researchers took a close look at like how medical students think, medical students can't go from mechanism to symptom. They also cannot go from symptom presentation back to the mechanism that they studied in their textbook. The body is just simply too complex. Every case is somewhat unique that it becomes a real challenge to make this jump from medical education in the classroom to medical practice in the hospital. So the training challenge is, how do you train expertise given this situation? Now, if you transpose this to business, we have a similar challenge in business and in investing, right? Like, how would you train a novice business student when they only learn certain business concepts in a textbook? We know that experienced investors and operators know not to fixate on a concept, or they know not to hold on to frameworks too tightly. And the reason is because, they've seen enough of the real world to know that it doesn't match perfectly with their models, that the models that they learn are the models that are often communicated in classrooms and in books. As an example of this, if you can think of a business example, scale economies, right, may be a competitive advantage. But the way that scale economies show up really depends on the time period, the industry, the competitive dynamic, and what sort of situation are you, what sort of context are you reasoning about? Are you a competitor? Are you the business that's about to go after scale economies as a competitive advantage? There's a huge number of variables here. And I guess for investors, the common sort of concept is intrinsic value. If you can say that, we are a value investor and we invest in intrinsic value, but if you've any experience in investing, you will know that the way intrinsic value shows up in the real world is hugely variable, right? What is intrinsic value? What matters for an intrinsic value calculation for company A may be completely different from company B, depending on what kind of company it is. So the issue, if you've been in any business school, you will notice that business novices hold on to the concepts too tightly. They use rigid formulas, or they want the clarity of rigid formulas, or they apply frameworks too mechanistically, too rigid, I guess is the right word, right? So again, how to train expertise. Now, the researchers who created cognitive flexibility theory knew that the answer is not from trying to tackle the how to train question directly, but to go at asking, how do the experts think? If we know how the experts think and how they actually, do what they do, then we can ask a simpler question, which is like, how do experts in ill-structured domains think, so that we can then copy them and build their thinking patterns into our training programs. So the question that we want to answer is, how do experts in ill-structured domains think when nearly every case in their domain is unique? As a side note, right, the reason why cognitive flexibility, the researchers behind CFT looked into this in the first place was because at the time that they started investigating this question, there already was a theory of expertise for well-structured domains. Think chess, for example. Yes, there are a lot of combinations of chess pieces and chess positions, but it's a relatively bounded domain compared to the sheer complexity and chaos of business or the human body, or new diseases that may emerge, and then new treatment plans, right, in medicine. So CFT is really a theory of real-world expertise, which is probably why we're talking about it. Okay, let's move on, right? Cognitive flexibility theory makes two claims about experts. The first claim is that experts reason about unique cases by combining fragments of previous cases that they've seen. I want you to just hold on to that observation for a bit. We'll come back. And the second thing, and this requires a bit more elaboration, is that experts have something called an adaptive worldview. They do not believe that there is one root cause or one concept for any case. Let's talk a bit more about the adaptive worldview because there's quite a bit to unpack there. Experts expect cases to have emergent properties, and they know that cases will be inherently unpredictable, irregular, and indeterminate. When this is a function of the complexity of the real world, you've got too many variables that can interact in too many unexpected ways for you to be able to reason out all of these interactions. As a result, experts don't simplify. They do not simplify cases into generalizable principles, right? It's just too hard. Instead, what they do is that they hold the cases in their heads, remembering salient details. And the implication here, and the thing that's actually important to this talk, is as a result of this, cognitive approach to the complexity of the real world, they actively seek out and collect novel cases over the course of their careers. Why do experts do this? Why do they think like this? All right? The answer, I think, is quite simple. This is a cognitive adaptation to the complexity and the chaos of reality. The answer is that when the domain is ill-structured, right, concepts alone are quite useless. There's just simply too much variation and variability in the way that they show up. So as a result, right, cases are as, if not more important than concepts. You actually do have to grapple with all the ways that these concepts can show up in the real world. And so experts remember the cases instead. They do not try to reduce into concept or principle or framework alone. So here's an example, right? And this example is actually quite meaningful to me because I remember looking into Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett when I was fairly young, and my background is computer science, which is a STEM field, right? A science technology field. And in a STEM domain, we are taught that first principles thinking is the best, open, closed, inverted quotes, the best kind of thinking. And I found myself increasingly puzzled as to why Charlie Munger kept using analogies. So here's an example. If you can't see the slides because you're just listening to the audio, I'm basically quoting a LinkedIn post from a startup founder named Daniel Lewis. And Daniel Lewis was the founder of Ravolaw. And Ravolaw at the time, this was 2019, it was a startup that was doing computer-aided case research, right? And it had a huge partnership with Harvard and was scanning all of Harvard's corpus of case law. And he had the opportunity to pitch Charlie Munger, and he presented his startup idea, and Lewis basically sort of presents and argues that we want, it says that they want to win a position in the legal research market with analytics, and then later expand the tools until it's a complete alternative to the incumbents, which is, LexisNexis. And the claim that Lewis makes to Charlie Munger is that our technology scales efficiently, so we can also offer lower prices. Charlie responds with the following quip. This reminds me of the cola wars between Pepsi and Coke. Up until the Great Depression, Pepsi and Coke were priced the same, and Coke was dominating the market. But then Pepsi cut their price per ounce by half, and their sales took off, with profits doubling too. Price can be a powerful competitive tool when you have a good substitute product. So I found this very puzzling. Like, why would he not bring in some abstract concept like pricing power or competitive arbitrage or something like that, right? But cognitive flexibility theory gave me the answer, right? I think this is my reasoning, but I believe that this is accurate. I think it's normal for expert business people and investors to reference specific cases in the past. Munger, does this a lot very clearly, but there are others, successful business people that I know who think in this way. And the reason I think is because if you think in the way that CFT describes how expert business people think, right, it is not actually natural to cite a concept or an abstract framework or an abstract principle because it's just not complete. Instead, it's easier to lean into the natural way that your brain is trained to think, to cite a salient case, which then brings along all the context, right? And also immediately sort of invokes we're all quite careful about overgeneralizing when we are talking about specific historical cases. And so there's some usefulness in bringing along the full context of a case when reasoning about a new case, right, without trying to overgeneralize or trying to come up with some abstract framework that applies to every situation under the sun. Anyway, if you believe CFT's claims and you believe that experts in such domains reason this way, I think you will find it quite hard to not notice that expert business people and expert investors do reason like this. Okay, let's move on. How do we use this? The most obvious application is actually to take Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett's advice, and the countless investors over the years who have said similar things, and take their advice to heart, right? All these investors sort of say, read, and read a lot. And reading is reading biography, reading history is useful to you, right? But the way that you do it, CFT tells you exactly what you should do as you're following this advice, right? When you're reading articles or reports or biographies or 10Ks or annual, financial statements, what have you, look out for concept instantiations. Don't think like the naive sort of like lessons that we saw earlier in this talk. Don't think, what's the lesson here? Instead think, oh, this is another one of those. And then file away the salient concepts, the salient cases, the cases that really leap out at you as instantiations of specific concepts. Your goal in life now becomes to collect as many cases as quickly as possible so that nothing surprises you anymore. And of course, this is what Buffett and Munger and other wise people do, right? This is why they spend so much time consuming and reading information through various, printed things. Books are not dead. They're not dead if you know how to use them well. Now let's take a look at how the researchers recommend using this, right? Because that's slightly different from what Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger and these esteemed value investors recommend. The researchers, which is Rand Spiro, who is the guy who created cognitive flexibility theory, right? They recommend two things. First, they recommend that you give students 10 to 20 cases for each concept. And the reasoning behind that is that you want to accelerate case exposure. You don't want them to form a rigid understanding of the concept. You don't want to teach the concept with just one example so that, they think that, oh, this is just like the concept is very important, so I need to hold on to the framework tightly, right? Instead, the cases that you feed them should contain enough surprising similarities and surprising dissimilarities so that the students are immediately disequilibrated. They are unbalanced a little. They don't settle on one canonical example of the concept that they're studying. The second thing is, Rand Spiro and his fellow researchers recommend that you tell students before you give them the cases that things are not so simple, right? Prime them for the adaptive worldview. Say something like, you are going to have to expect the unexpected because you are dealing with the real world and the real world will throw curveballs at you. Everything you see in the future will be somewhat unique. Now, I mentioned before that cognitive flexibility theory comes from this book called Accelerated Expertise, right? And Accelerated Expertise contains all the training programs that have been successfully implemented in the US military over the past 10, 20-year period. How has CFT already been used successfully? And the answer, as far as I can tell, is that one case is not enough. So Accelerated Expertise covers a lot of industrial and military training programs, and the military training programs in particular tend to be simulation-based. But because CFT tells you that experts are able to reason in fundamentally novel situations by combining fragments of prior cases they've seen, then the objective of the training program becomes accelerate case exposure, right? Don't just do one simulation. Don't just do one Harvard Business School study. I mean, the whole approach of Harvard Business School study is a bit suspect once you understand what CFT is trying to say. But you have to do many. And indeed, the way the Marine Corps does their training, for example, is simulation-based, and there is a huge expectation to do many, many simulations, hundreds actually, by the time that you graduate. So many training programs described in the book consist of many simulations, not just one simulation. And each simulation, the variety of simulations, allow you to build this cognitive flexibility necessary to perform in the chaotic real world. And that sort of explains why I've said, earlier in this talk, I said that I've experimented with this enough to know that it works. And the reason is because I've created a library. We've created a library at Common Cog, right? It's a constantly growing collection of business narratives, business stories, things that have happened in the past, right? And it's organized according to concept, right? And we've run experiments over the course of 2 years now, actually, trying to see if we can accelerate business pattern matching through a corpus of constantly growing cases. One way of thinking about this approach of accelerated expertise through accelerated exposure of cases is that there is a certain progression towards expert that you can sort of squint and imagine. Right? So the very lowest tier is that you think in terms of frameworks or concepts. You think that the framework is the thing. And then after some experience, right, some real world experiences perhaps, or if you're wise, you will read, you begin to realize that the framework is an imperfect description of what happens. And usually, to be fair, business professors and teachers, people on blogs or on podcasts will say the framework is never perfect, right? The map is not the territory. They will pay lip service to it. And so you were like, okay, yeah, frameworks are never perfect. They never match the actual implementation or the actual instantiation. But then the next step is that you realize that it's best to just hold the framework loosely because you know that it doesn't apply perfectly to any real-world case. And CFT suggests that at the highest level, at the final stage, when you become an expert, you drop the framework and you reason mostly from fragments of cases because that actually reflects the complexity of the real world. The funny thing, though, is that you may still use the framework for communication because that's the way that humans are built to think, right? We want clarity. We don't want to deal with the chaos of reality. And so we use frameworks to communicate with each other. We use concepts and labels, buckets, to talk to each other. But you no longer think using the framework. You think in terms of fragments, which is therefore confusing to novices who are observing you as the expert because they would think that since you're giving lip service to the framework, that's how you actually think, but you don't think like that. Okay, let's wrap up and let's just land the plane and bring this back to the early questions that we had at the start of this talk. What have we learned today? Well, at the very top of this talk, we had two questions, right? The first question was, how do business experts learn from history? And we know the answer to that now, right? They learn from history by reading for concept instantiations, not for lessons. And the second question that we asked is, how do you copy these experts to accelerate your expertise? And we also know the answer to that question. You seek out as many cases as possible, as quickly as possible, so that you expand the set of cases in your head. And of course, the second thing is you adopt the adaptive worldview today. You adopt it, you just know that any case that you look at cannot be simply represented with a Platonic ideal, with a framework or a model that explains everything perfectly. Now let's go through a general recap of the various things, the various ideas that we've presented in this talk, right? We open up with the concept of ill-structured domains. And the ill-structured domains are domains where there are concepts, but the concepts are highly variable when they show up in the real world. Examples here include medicine, business, investing. The challenge of expertise in such ill-structured domains is that everything is unique, right? And so, as a result, cases are more important than concepts or frameworks, which will always be somewhat lossy. Finally, we got to the two main claims of cognitive flexibility theory, which is that experts in ill-structured domains combine fragments of prior cases, number one, and number two, they hold an adaptive worldview, which by this point you should be quite familiar because I've been repeating it again and again. One final thing. What does this have to do with wisdom, right? I opened the talk with a quippy quip. Right? I said that one definition of wisdom might be not making mistakes that you did not have to make. And the quippy quip that I use, adapted for business, was a decade of business experience can often save a few months of biography reading. But if you zoom up a little from business and apply it to life, right, you can say that what we've just covered applies as much to approaching life the same way that business experts approach business. So I believe that people who are wise beyond their years, right, have the following properties. And don't get me wrong, right? I'm not saying that people who are wise beyond their years have the answers to life's questions or have the answers to what to do in particular points in their lives. I don't think they do. I don't think anybody does. But if you use this approach to life the same way that you use this approach of reading a lot to improve the set of cases that you recognize in business or investing, right? Then it goes to reason that the people who do this for their lives have seen more. They're able to say when something happens in their lives, oh, this is another one of those. Not that it will happen to them necessarily, but that they shouldn't be surprised because it happened before to somebody else. So they shouldn't be surprised if it happens to them. And so they're not as taken by surprise. And as a result, because they're not as taken by surprise and they can rely on the pool of experience outside their heads, you can say that they know what matters over the arc of a human life. I think this is one definition of wisdom. If you find that too highfalutin, then it's my hope that if there's only one thing that you take away from all of this, I hope you never read a biography the same way again. Thank you for listening.